Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to our program today on income inequality during the pandemic, the widening gap, featuring Dr. Jason Scott Smith. If you join us on Monday for our program on understanding the US-China summit, you heard about the US-China relationship and why this meeting was held in our backyard here in Anchorage, Alaska. If you missed it, all of our programs are recorded and posted on our website. So Monday's programs can be accessed through our website. 133 people did that with just one day of posting this program online. So thank you everyone out there for listening, for joining, and for supporting the Alaska World Affairs Council. While China may seem like the biggest threat to the United States, some will argue that income inequality is actually a bigger threat to the United States than China. This is a program I spoke to Dr. Smith about over a year and a half ago before the pandemic, and he was supposed to be here last spring. The pandemic hit, and who would have known then that this issue would be magnified the way it is right now. In downtown Anchorage, it's 25 degrees with clear blue skies. You can see the mountains are out, the sleeping lady. I hope the air is fresh and the waters are clean wherever you are around the world today. Please do let us know where you are. Say hello to us in the chat room. We will also be having the Q&A at the end, where we will let people ask questions directly of our speakers. So if you'd like to do it directly, just let us know. We'll turn your camera on and we'll bring you on screen and let you ask Dr. Scott Smith the question directly, or you can type it into the chat room or the question box, and I'll read it for you. The World Affairs Council is part of 90 World Affairs Councils around the United States, and we welcome everyone who is listening to join in our program today. We are super excited that the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce has finalists for their 2021 Alaska Young Professional of the Year Award, and two of those finalists are board members of the Alaska World Affairs Council. Shout out to Dr. Daniel Volan and Laura Sturdivant-Dean. We wish you well in this wonderful, deserving award, and look forward to finding out who is the finalist. We have some great programs coming up in April. There are a lot of them, and all of them will be worth your time. Put the World Affairs Council on your planner and take a lunch break with us for a virtual lunch program as part of our series. If you have any high school students, sign them up for a unique opportunity that we are going to be having on April 7th. It is our speed mentoring, which is going virtual this year. And it's a fun, fast way to learn about career opportunities. So have your kiddos join us on April 7th. We also have two more programs in April. We'll have a slide deck at the end. You'll see what those are, and we hope you are able to join us then. I'll be back for the Q&A. At this time, though, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Ben Kelly, CEO of the Launch Company. He's a former speaker of the World Affairs Council, program chair, vice chair of the Alaska World Affairs Council Board of Directors, great person, and a newlywed. Ben will be introducing our speaker today. Ben, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate it. Super excited to be here today, and very excited to get the chance to introduce Dr. Jason Scott Smith, who will be speaking to us today about the widening gap, income inequality during the pandemic. He's an award-winning author and professor, and is currently a professor of history at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Smith was recently a Fulbright Scholar to the University College Dublin, where he focused on the history of capitalism. A specialist in the history of capitalism and political economy, Dr. Smith is the author of Building New Deal Liberalism, the Political Economy of Public Works, and A Concise History of the New Deal. Before his current position at the University of New Mexico, he held fellowships at the Harvard Business School and at Cornell University. He completed his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and was recently quoted prominently in a New York Times story on historians and making sense of the Trump administration. And you will find a link to this article on the Alaska World Affairs Council's Facebook page. It is such a pleasure to have you here today speaking for the Alaska World Affairs Council. Welcome, Dr. Jason Scott Smith. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben and Lisa, and thank all of you for attending, and those of you watching on Zoom. What a world we live in with Zoom. I think once you get your second shot, you're allowed to delete the app, but for now we have it, and it makes amazing things happen. I'm a historian, so what I want to do today is to try to put the issue of income inequality in some kind of historical context. So I'll try to do that today, particularly as a historian who's worked a great deal on the Great Depression of the 1930s and the history of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And I hope to close with some reflections about what this particular kind of historical perspective can offer us in our present moment. So I think the pandemic has done two things for us in thinking about the issue of income inequality. First, I think the pandemic has revealed the structures of income inequality. It's made them more visible to all of us, I think. And second, it has exacerbated them. It has exacerbated income inequality across longstanding lines of class, race, and gender. And so let me try to take each of those categories and say a few words about each of them. Let's start with class. According to the Institute for Policy Studies, the combined wealth of all US billionaires in 2020 increased by 39%, from approximately $3 trillion to a little over $4 trillion. Of the more than 600 US billionaires, the richest five, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Warren Buffett, and Elon Musk, these five saw an 85% increase in their combined wealth during this last year, from about $360 billion to $661 billion. Full disclosure, I am not in that group. This is one of the reasons I have time today to meet with all of you. I can assure you I'm not zooming in from one of my yachts, particularly because there are no yachts. The rollout of vaccines around the world reflects the inequality around us. High-income nations, such as the United States and members of the European Union, have been getting a disproportionate share of vaccine doses. Despite making up only 16% of the globe's population, the people in high-income nations have gotten 56% of all vaccine doses. In contrast, the people in lower-income nations who have just gotten 1.1%, I'll say that again, 0.1% of all vaccine doses, despite making up 9% of the world's population. So extreme pandemic disparities are not unique to the United States. I mentioned the increase in billionaire wealth in 2020. In contrast, the combined earning for global workers fell in 2020 by almost $4 trillion as millions of people lost their jobs around the world. And this recession, again, thinking in terms of class, has hit lowest income workers the hardest. According to the University of Chicago, the lowest income group had the highest job loss rate during 2020, while the highest income workers had the lowest job loss rate during the last year. If you think with me for a minute about the vaccination process, early data suggests that the racial groups most at risk of the virus are not receiving the most shots. According to data from 23 states that was analyzed by the Kaiser Family Foundation, Black infection and death rates are significantly higher than their vaccination rates. And Louisiana has the widest gap, with Black death rates 26 percentage points higher than Black vaccination rates. What are the factors at stake here? The digital divide is one explanation for this racial vaccine gap, since lack of internet access can make it more difficult to secure appointments. NPR has found that in many areas, vaccine sites, they're located outside of Black and Latinx neighborhoods. Surveys also indicate higher rates of vaccine hesitancy among people of color due to a long history of racist medical mistreatment. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has forced many workers into remote teleworking as offices have closed around the country. But not everyone has had the same ability to work from home. Pre-pandemic figures indicate in the United States, only about 20% of Black and 16% of Latinx people work in jobs where they are even able to telework, compared to almost 30% of white and 37% of Asian workers. This gap, combined with research that has documented that Black and Latinx people now make up disproportionate numbers of jobs deemed essential, helps explain why people of color have been exposed to greater risks from the virus. The COVID-19 pandemic, it has also exacerbated long-standing gender inequalities. Women are more likely than men to work in service occupations, jobs like domestic work, restaurant service, retail, tourism, hospitality, jobs that require face-to-face interactions and have been hard hit by layoffs. And again, because of the nature of these jobs, teleworking is not an option for many women. Frontline jobs, the ones deemed most essential and require people to work in person, are also heavily staffed by women. Think about it. Healthcare, social work, government, community-based service sectors are made up overwhelmingly by female employees. Women make up approximately 3/4, 75% of workers in government and community-based services, healthcare workers, and social workers. And as you might expect, these gender differences are also inflected by categories of race and ethnicity. Women of color suffer disproportionately. Now, we might still see a V-shaped economic recovery, right? A kind of sharp bounce back as things reopen, but it's a real danger. The persistence and worsening of income inequality that I've been talking about, the danger that we might see instead a kind of K-shaped recovery, right? People who have jobs or are in more secure sectors of the economy will see an upwards trending recovery, the happy part of the letter K, but many who are unemployed or in more precarious sectors will experience an ongoing decline, right? The downside of that K. So enough good news. How can history help? Alas, often history cannot help. I'm fond of a saying from a Russian medieval historian that history at times it teaches nothing, it only punishes you for not learning its lessons. I'm fond of the sort of perverse contradictory nature of that saying. History teaches nothing, it only punishes you for not learning its lessons. That said, history can help. It can help by giving us perspective about how to think about what Mark Twain once called the rhymes between the past and the present. So I want now to turn to a period in the past that can help give us some historical perspective on our present moment. The Great Depression of the 1930s, or as economists Claudia Golden and Robert Margo put it, the Great Compression of the 1930s. What do they mean by this? A time, the 30s, of course, a time of great economic disaster, but also a period when economic inequality shrank. The compression between the richest and poorest, that gap narrowed dramatically. Wealth distribution, income distribution between the rich and the poor in the 1930s became much smaller than it had been in preceding time periods. How did this happen in the midst of the Great Depression? We can understand how this happened by looking at the legacies of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. During the depths of the Great Depression, the New Deal fashioned a series of revolutionary transformations. It created a new set of public policy tools for confronting the collapse of capitalism. In using these tools, reformers provided immediate relief to the unemployed while simultaneously investing in long-term economic prosperity. The New Deal laid the foundations for a growing middle class to share in the benefits of home ownership and economic growth after World War II. Finally, the New Deal helped to transform the presidency and the role of the federal government in American society. The common saying is, think about how Americans encountered the federal government before the New Deal. They mainly encountered the federal government when they went to the post office, right? This network of the federal postal system. After the New Deal, Americans encountered the federal government in multiple domains of their lives, both working and as retirees, young in life and old in life. The federal government touched everyone's life in dramatically different ways. So all of these accomplishments, they hold significant implications for understanding the present day state of the United States. And so too, I should add, do the New Deal's flaws. And in many ways, the New Deal's accomplishments and shortcomings have shaped the entire trajectory of post-war history. The nature of race relations, the ongoing debate about the proper role of government in regulating the market economy, and current questions about the long-term viability of entitlement programs like Social Security. The central idea underlying much of the New Deal's public policy was that of state-sponsored economic development. And in deploying this idea, New Dealers were at once empirical, flexible, inconsistent, and boldly experimental. They embraced precedent when it served their purposes and abandoned it when it did not. They brought new forms of social and economic expertise into the American state as lawyers, economists, civil engineers, social workers, and others became key parts of the federal bureaucracy, but on an entirely new scale. These professions would reshape American statecraft in the last half of the 20th century. State-sponsored economic investment, what does this mean? It means this: approximately 2/3 of the New Deal spending went toward building public works projects. The famous economist Joseph Schumpeter once declared that the budget is the skeleton of the state stripped of all misleading ideologies, right? The budget is the skeleton of the state stripped of all misleading ideologies. What does this mean? If you look where the money is spent, you see something fundamental about the priorities of a particular government. So 2/3 of the New Deal spending going to public works projects. The government invested these funds in all but 3 of the nation's 3,071 counties. So the scale and scope of this economic stimulus secured the foundations for forging a national market in the post-war years. The New Deal spending spurred dramatic advances in economic productivity, improving the nation's transportation networks, building thousands of miles of roads, hundreds of airports, expanding domestic military bases and facilities, and drawing up the blueprints for a national highway system. This public investment also foreshadowed the rise of the Sun Belt. It was no accident that the developing West, and to a lesser extent the underdeveloped American South, welcomed the arrival of federal dollars in their regions. While investing for the future, the New Deal's public works programs created millions of jobs, both direct employment at the construction site and indirect employment, thanks to the multiplier effect of public spending. So with this kind of public works spending, the New Deal gave to future American politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, a policy tool that would be used to influence overseas development from the onset of the Cold War through the Vietnam War and continuing to today. As one political scientist said of the Tennessee Valley Authority, right, this network of hydroelectric dams created by the New Deal, as one political scientist put it, the TVA has proved to be the New Deal's most exportable product. So the New Deal saved capitalism. In addition to investing in the nation's infrastructure to put people back to work, the New Deal stabilized the financial system, separating commercial and investment banking via the Glass-Steagall Act, creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, to protect the savings of ordinary Americans, and creating the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, to bring order and transparency to the nation's capital markets. Organized labor gained the right to bargain collectively through the Wagner Act, and, although initially limited, measures like the Social Security Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act were important steps taken by the New Dealers to mitigate the impact of the Great Depression on working people, to address income inequality. New Dealers attempted to address the plight of farmers, seeking to stabilize the market for cash crops through the Agricultural Adjustment Administration to relieve suffering in rural America. So taken together, all of these various elements of the New Deal's policy toolkit signaled a willingness to react boldly to economic emergency, to experiment constantly, and to adjust to changing circumstances. In so doing, the New Deal did more than succeed simply by not repeating the mistakes of Herbert Hoover's administration. It succeeded in the long run as well by helping to build a strong middle-class society in the post-war United States, a society that was able to incorporate new ethnic groups as well as many elements of the nation's working class. Organized labor, which was a little over 7% of the workforce in 19 1930, grew to over 18% by 1940, and hit 27% by 1945. Catholics and Jews began to become part of the mainstream of the nation's political, social, and cultural life. To be sure, segregationists and racist Southern whites, and racist Northern whites for that matter, were also key parts of the New Deal coalition, and Franklin Roosevelt was loath to anger their powerful representatives in Congress, with a number of consequences that we might talk further about in the Q&A. Nevertheless, the New Deal provided more assistance by far than Hoover had to African Americans, to people of color, to Native Americans suffering from the Great Depression. The New Deal began this work of expanding the nation's middle class by making home ownership more affordable through the Home Owners Loan Corporation and Federal Housing Administration backed mortgages. Millions of Americans who might have only been able to rent their homes were instead able to purchase property and begin to secure better prospects for themselves and their children. Americans, whether they self-identified as workers, as consumers, as tax-paying homeowners, they all benefited from what economist John Kenneth Galbraith has called the countervailing power wielded by the New Deal. And what Galbraith meant by this was the federal government, it was a countervailing power. It gave concrete backing to ordinary citizens, the support from the federal government, to balance the power held by business in the economy. While the New Deal successfully alleviated the impact of the Great Depression and helped build an enlarged middle class after World War II, it also began construction of what Franklin Roosevelt, construction of what historian Arthur Schlesinger labeled of Franklin Roosevelt the imperial presidency. With the dramatic expansion of the federal government that had begun under the New Deal, Roosevelt and his advisors faced the challenge of managing a vastly enlarged bureaucracy. And so what did the federal government do? It created the Executive Office of the President in 1939. Let's rethink the entire executive branch of government. So the federal government started to restructure and reorganize the enormous new number of agencies that had been created to counter capitalism's collapse. You know, the response to an economic crisis that lessened income inequality, it was necessary to really build a bureaucracy to do that job. So with this new organizational template in place, new bodies and agencies going forward would be placed under the supervision of the president and his cabinet officers during the remainder of the 20th and 21st century. So the Council of Economic Advisors, the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Homeland Security, these are all organizational examples of what the New Deal started to do with the federal government. The welfare state built by the New Deal represented the federal government's assumption of the power to intervene in the economy. Measures like Social Security, unemployment insurance, and public works employment functioned to ameliorate the harsh effects of the Depression, helping to smooth out the business cycle. The 1946 Fair Employment Act, which created the Council of Economic Advisors, enshrined into law the principle that the federal government could and should act vigorously to prevent future depressions. While the New Deal's programs were intended to address the economic crisis of the 1930s, the intellectual scaffolding for these efforts was not widely recognized or even really developed until after World War II, with the widespread adoption of Keynesian theory in managing modern economies. While the New Deal failed to end mass unemployment during the Great Depression, right? It's World War II that really delivers that, that triumph. Its post-World War II economists across the political spectrum finally recognized the stimulus provided by federal spending on wartime mobilization and massive amounts of federal spending. What did this do? It served to legitimate the effectiveness of government intervention in the economy, right? Unemployment by 1943, in the midst of the US mobilization for war, had dropped to approximately 1%. And it was recognized across partisan lines that this was the power of federal spending to fight unemployment to help fight inequality. So these achievements, as politicians, journalists, scholars, concerned citizens, as we all try to make sense of our present moment, what does this historical perspective give us? The achievements of the New Deal, using the power of government to intervene significantly in society, countered the blows of the Great Depression, helped to address structural inequalities, profoundly narrowed the gap between the rich and the poor. Economic collapses, though, are not black swans, right? They are not birds so rare that they might as well not exist. Rather, the Great Depression that began in 1929, the Great Recession that began in 2008, the economic impact of the 2020 pandemic, as all of these events demonstrate, economic collapses should be thought of as white swans, birds we have seen before. The performance of the federal government during the Great Depression and World War II, along with the development of the discipline of macroeconomics since the 1940s, has provided nations and their leaders today with an explicit, workable approach for responding to economic crises. These hard-won insights of political and economic history, though, have been lost upon those who choose to ignore the past in order to advance their own ideological agendas. In recent years, a number of politicians have argued that federal spending has actually had no impact whatsoever on the economy. I'd include in this number of politicians a former governor of Alaska, Sarah Palin, the former Republican National Committee Chairman, Michael Steele, who charged, not in the history of mankind has the government ever created a job. Small business owners do, small enterprises do, not the government. When the government contract runs out, that job goes away. Another person, Jacob Hornberger, the president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, declared, Americans might well rue the day when they trusted the federal government to spend the nation into prosperity. It just isn't going to happen. But my point here in quoting these characters is to say it did happen during the Great Depression. With the exception of the 1937 and 38 recession, when Franklin Roosevelt followed conservative orthodoxy and cut public spending, every year of the New Deal witnessed increases in the nation's GDP, averaging between 8% and 10% per year, coupled with decreasing unemployment. Economist Christy Romer has judged these rates of growth are spectacular, even for an economy pulling out of a severe depression. When Franklin Roosevelt took office, unemployment as a percentage of the civilian labor force stood at 21%. And as a percentage of the civilian private non-farm labor force, unemployment had hit 30%, a third of the workforce. By 1937, 4 years of New Deal policies had cut unemployment in the civilian labor force in half, down to just a little over 9%. Viewed as a percentage of the civilian private non-farm labor force, unemployment had been cut by the New Deal by almost 2/3, down to 13%. Now 9%, 13%, these are big numbers, but the scale of that achievement, the hole they are digging out of, it's impressive. The economic stimulus provided by renewed public spending associated with wartime mobilization drove unemployment down further to historic lows. By 1944, 11 years after Franklin Roosevelt's first inauguration, unemployment in the civilian labor force was 1.23%. The GDP of the United States, the gross domestic product, the sum of all goods and services produced by an economy, this figure grew at an average rate of 3% per capita every year on average between 1940 and 1973. That's a pretty good run. Thanks to the policies inaugurated by the New Deal, the United States began to recover from the disastrous economic mismanagement of Herbert Hoover, started an unprecedented run of economic growth. With this dramatic public investment associated with the New Deal in World War II, a generation of Americans witnessed the power of federal spending to bring about economic growth and virtually eliminate mass unemployment. With the regulations put in place by the New Deal, this same generation recognized the necessity of government to a functioning and thriving economy. So let me try to pull things together and conclude. What does this historical perspective offer us today? Let me try to offer a few speculative conclusions, and I look forward and welcome to seeing what you all think in our question and answer period. So stepping back, what can we try to conclude? A great number of factors produced the New Deal. In approximate sense, of course, Franklin Roosevelt and his many advisors were the people who most directly shaped the specific nature of the federal government's response to the Great Depression. But these men and women, these New Dealers, were not anti-capitalist. Rather, they aimed to repair the inequalities wrought by the capitalist system and restore American confidence in the nation's market economy. In a sense, they are saving capitalism from the capitalists and for the capitalists. While at times unsure of the best tools to use for this job, the New Dealers, especially Roosevelt, embraced their task with enormous energy. The legacies of what this energy have achieved have continued to resonate in the years since the 1930s. The 1940s, the New Dealers led the United States into war, economically, socially, and militarily mobilizing the entire country. In the process, Roosevelt even claimed an unprecedented third and fourth term in office as president. While the war reshaped the New Deal in turn shaped important aspects of how the war effort was prosecuted, both institutionally and ideologically. After the war, thinking internationally, the international settlement, crafted in the wake of the devastation of a global depression, a world war, also owed much to the New Deal, as American reformers worked with representatives from other nations to construct international institutions that might better manage the global economy, public health, and security. Finally, in the longer run, the political economy built by the New Dealers proved to be a vital factor in stimulating the larger growth and prosperity experienced not only in the United States, but also in much of the world between 1940 and 1973. While the New Deal was a multifaceted set of public policies, it was also a political movement. Roosevelt and his allies in the Democratic Party strove to pull the nation out of the Great Depression, but in so doing, they also wanted to remake the American political system. While Roosevelt and his advisors might be considered the people most directly responsible for the New Deal, I should add that other people played vital roles in shaping this episode in American reform and politics. Labor leaders such as John Lewis and Sidney Hillman pushed the federal government to more actively address the state of organized labor and the plight of working people. Eleanor Roosevelt, along with Democratic Party officials such as Molly Dewson, worked to carve out a public role for women in the New Deal. And A. Philip Randolph, Walter White, Mary McLeod Bethune, and other African-American leaders pressed Roosevelt to extend New Deal benefits to Black citizens. The actions of American citizens also shaped the range of political possibilities available during the 1930s, whether they were voting, striking, marching, shopping, or even staying at home. Everyday people mattered too. Any attempt to assess the question of historical responsibility for the New Deal should try to address deeper roots and causes. We can think about what this might mean for today as well. And so I think we would be remiss if we did not spotlight the one person without whom the New Deal would not have been possible, Herbert Hoover. Without Hoover's inadequate and utterly insufficient record of economic stewardship during his presidency, two things would not have happened. First, the nation would not have learned that Hoover's conservative approach to managing the economy was no longer a viable proposition, either as a political ideology or as an example of effective public policy. Second, Hoover's achievement in so thoroughly discrediting his own economic approach over such a sustained period of time, the many months of his presidency, created a huge opportunity in American politics that Roosevelt and the Democratic Party were able to exploit during the 1930s and for years afterward. When Roosevelt declared in his 1933 inaugural address, "This nation is asking for action and action now," This proclamation resonated enormously with an American public that had for too long suffered under Hoover's record of insufficient response to the growth of unemployment and inequality. To many ordinary Americans, then, the main achievement of Hoover's philosophy of governance lay in its impressive ability to somehow turn ordinary unemployment into mass unemployment, as the percentage of people without a job skyrocketed to around 30% of the workforce by the close of Hoover's presidency. And for their part, business executives responded to Hoover's leadership in the Great Depression by voting in the marketplace with their company pocketbooks. Between 1929 and 1933, under a Republican president, private business investment in the American economy collapsed by about 87%. Now, I'm not a professional economist, I'm a historian, but when investment collapses by a factor of 87%, I think you are allowed to round up. You can say 90%. So what am I saying here? Let me close. In short, without Hoover's multi-year record of deep and wide failure in the face of tremendous economic calamity, masses of people thrown out of work, 90% of business investment destroyed, the nation's gross domestic product collapsing by a factor of 1/3. Without this, the New Deal as a reform movement and a political undertaking could not have been possible. You know, the actions it took to address income inequality and mass unemployment would not have been possible without the kind of multi-month, multi-year advertisement, if you will, of the Hoover administration for the inadequacy of his approach. So I hope this historical perspective offers us some insight into how the United States and other nations should address income inequality as we work to overcome the impact of the global pandemic. We need another intervention from government on the scale of the original New Deal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. We have some questions coming through. I'm looking forward to talking with you about your kudos for Hoover, and if that same kudos will go towards our prior administration. And we have a great question in our Q&A from John Larson. John, I'll ask your question next. If you don't want to do it yourself, just let me know if you want to ask your question in person and we'll bring you on the screen. So while I'm waiting for that, question for you, Dr. Smith. So we had our program, like I mentioned, on Monday about the China-Alaska summit. And here in Alaska, we think a lot about national security. What does it mean for the United States when it comes to China, when it comes to Russia? And then we talk about income inequality. Is this actually a bigger threat to the United States than some of these other countries that we're looking at? And where would you put your dollars? You're talking a lot about federal dollars.
Wow, great questions. You know, the threat that income inequality poses to societies across the world is a real and profound one. Again, thinking historically for a moment, Roosevelt came into office in 1933 with Hitler in power in Germany and Mussolini in power in Italy. And many Americans looked at those situations and reflected on the state of the economy and society and politics in the United States and were concerned. We remember Roosevelt's first inaugural address for his ringing declaration that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. But the line in the speech that got the most applause, and it was enormous, was his pledge that if Congress would not act, he would seize emergency power and act as if a president in a time of wartime emergency. And this got an enormous roar from the crowd. And Eleanor Roosevelt recorded in her personal diary how terrifying it was to hear people respond to such a declaration in that fashion. You know, I think many of us are familiar with the work of Sinclair Lewis and his 1930s work, It Can't Happen Here. You know, a fascist movement can't happen here, but what if it did? What if it could? Would fascism come wrapped in the American flag and carrying a cross, as some have suggested? So I think there are very real concerns about what income inequality, as it grows and persists and strengthens, what that can do to the fabric of social and political stability in multiple nations.
Super. Okay, I'm going to bring on John Larson now. And if you could just unmute and turn on your camera, John, you can ask your question directly of our speaker here today.
All right. Mike, thanks very much for being here first off. And my question is in regards to the widening gap in income inequality. I had heard that the richest 1% of Americans own 50% of the wealth value of the stock market, and that the richest 10% of Americans own 90% of the value of the stock market. Have you heard of these numbers, and is there any way to verify their accuracy?
I have not heard of those numbers, and I'm not sure if I could verify that in real time for you, but I can say, again, thinking historically, the concerns that many Americans have had over time about the concentration of wealth in the upper reaches of the American society has been real and profound, and has led to any number of important reforms and changes. If you think about the economist Thomas Piketty, the French economist, has written about thinking about inequality over time as the Golden Gate Bridge. And if you think about the spike in income inequality during the Gilded Age, and then the spike in income inequality and the concentration of wealth with larger and larger returns going to the wealthiest, happening in kind of a new Gilded Age of our recent and current past and present. That these are two things that we've seen. And we can think about the responses that we saw during the Gilded Age. We saw enormous periods of open labor capital violence in the streets of American cities. We saw the struggles of many reformers to implement things like the income tax, amending the Constitution to do something like that, to create and structure federal programs that not only helped improve the plight of the worst off, but also, as one historian has argued, represented a sort of search for stability. How can you bring order to a society that's in chaos? We interpret many of these reforms in the past as well-meaning and sort of, blows to, promote social justice. And they did do this, and many were intended to do this, but they were also part of a search for stability by people who were really worried about open violence in the streets of American cities.
All right, thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Great question.
Okay, and anyone can put in questions on the Q&A. I'll call on you in person or read your question if you'd like. So Dr. Smith, while we're waiting for more questions, I want to ask you about your kudos now to Hoover and our prior administration. So we posted an article you were quoted in from the New York Times, or not the New York Times, yeah, the New York Times, where historians are brought together at Princeton at the end of every administration to analyze the previous administration. And you're one of those people. I'm assuming this was all virtual this year. You weren't actually brought to Princeton. And you needed to analyze the administration. I'm guessing that had to do with federal spending and infrastructure. Can you talk a little bit about that and your thoughts on this topic with the prior administration and our plans forward?
Sure. I mean, that was a fascinating experience to be a part of that conversation. And indeed, it was over 2 days on Zoom. No one traveled with their hand sanitizer to Princeton, New Jersey, as enticing as that prospect is in the middle of a public health emergency. But we reflected on many different aspects of the Trump presidency. And I think one of the things that I took from that conversation, and we had historians who were writing on all sorts of different aspects of the past 4 years. But one thing I took from that was really, it matters the ways we interpret the past and the ways we think about it, because it really does shape how we see the terrain of the present and going forward. And I think just kind of looping in our current administration for a moment and thinking back to the Obama administration for a moment as well, what do we see the Biden administration doing? they see the big lesson of the Obama years is they were too meek and too small in their attempts to stimulate the economy in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis. And we see that kind of history in a kind of very direct sense informing a set of decisions to go big, as they say, and to really put the full measure and power of the federal government to shape society in a profound way. And so I think we will see more of this kind of history mobilized. Whether that will change our own ordinary understandings of how we think about the past 4 years, how we think about the present and the future, that's a great question as well. I think that's up to all of us to decide that.
Okay, so you are now magically in charge of advising the current administration. Would you model the New Deal as part of your recommendations, or would you make it a New Deal version 102, or would it be something different, what you've learned?
I would say, I mean, I would not, it would be difficult for me to imagine, and this is true for like any historical period, simply running back the past strategy, note for note, a kind of New Deal 2.0. But if you were to use the New Deal as a kind of inspiration or touchstone, I think the idea of committing the full resources and kind of power of federal spending and even deficit spending to not just stimulate the economy. The New Deal didn't just build public works programs to build them. They built them because they believed and said explicitly, we want these to be socially useful examples of infrastructure. Infrastructure that helps improve roads, bridges, airports, but also helps provide access to swimming pools in all sorts of neighborhoods and communities, that improves access of Americans to education. 47% of all counties during the Great Depression received new school buildings built by the federal government with New Deal dollars. And many of those buildings are still in use today. So this kind of long-term investment, it's not just spending to spend, but it's investment. And what does investment have? It has future returns. Investment that brings returns to Americans in terms of increased prosperity, reduced inequality, and improved public health. These are things that the federal government was able to grope towards during the New Deal. They were figuring it out as they went, but today we actually have those textbooks on our shelves. They exist, people have written them. We can pull them off and read them and use them as a kind of inspiration to address the present.
Okay, so talking about infrastructure, let's go back to China and Russia. So income inequality is not just something like you mentioned here in the United States. It is something that we are seeing in other parts of the world. Can you touch a little bit about some other countries, the income inequality, and the dollars that are being spent on infrastructure, thinking specifically China, Russia, what that means?
Exactly. Well, it's profound. I mean, I think the One Belt, One Road initiative is clearly an example of what a nation state can do to address income inequality, but also reshape the kind of global balance of power. The relative size of the economy of China to the United States has changed dramatically over the last 10 years. And the trend lines are certainly worth looking at and thinking about. I think other people, other nations have seen the United States during the 20th century. The historian Thomas Hughes, he's a great historian of technology, has argued that people outside the United States have seen the US as what he calls a great building site. And he means that in two senses. One, a place where technology and public spending are mobilized together to change the infrastructure of a nation, but also a kind of building site where ideological networks can be mobilized in order to change society, to spread innovation and prosperity throughout a country. And his argument was that engineers from the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, engineers from South America saw something like the Tennessee Valley Authority they studied it, they wanted to copy it and replicate it. And so they saw this as an act of public intentionality that created these programs and this infrastructure and this prosperity as all of a piece. And the other part of Hughes's argument is that Americans have not fully realized the role of the federal government in spurring scientific innovation and technological progress in creating the kind of framework that allows the private economy to function and improve prosperity and fight inequality.
Okay, so what do you see if the United States decides not to do anything to change this widening gap of income inequality for our country?
Well, I would think the longest and the long-term consequences of a failure to address that is a real kind of social and political and economic decline. And we've seen nations decline in the past, and we've seen the consequences for the societies that experienced this decline in the past. And as I mentioned, Mark Twain earlier, his full saying attributed to him is that history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And I expect we will see some pretty disturbing and profound rhymes between that past and our present if that trend continues unchecked.
Okay, if anyone would like to ask the last question, you have a few seconds to type your question in or let me know, and I'll bring you on board. So Dr. Smith, while we're waiting for that, have you ever been to Alaska?
I have not. It is a fascinating place, and I've enjoyed reading and learning so much about it in the run up to this event.
And what do you do in your free time? What can we find you doing?
I try to pick up the things my son leaves around the house. I try to keep busy and stay out of trouble. I enjoy cooking. I play the violin. I read too much. It's a cry for help.
Okay, we've got a lot of readers I see here who have joined us today, and they are also running out of books because COVID has brought us all into getting into our stashes. We're really large that are now getting to be smaller and smaller. Any good tips on books for us?
Oh my goodness. I actually am currently reading, I have here on my desk, a collection of essays called States of Exception in American History. It's a collection edited by Gary Gerstle and Joel Isaac, and it's an exploration of ways in which the protections of the Constitution have been overridden over time, kind of states of exception and emergency, and the kind of legal and political consequences that flow from that. It's disturbing and interesting, so I highly recommend.
What was the name again?
States of Exception.
States of Exception.
In American History.
In American History. Any others?
I also have a classic 1963 account of the New Deal by the great historian William Leuchtenberg with the very simple title, Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal. If anyone's gone to college over the last 50 years, you probably encountered this textbook in a course on the New Deal if you took such a course. It's still worth reading today, I think.
Wonderful. And we have someone to ask our last question for today, and I'd like to bring on Mr. Jim Cantor.
So my question has to do with the income inequality of today. I'm not sure history, except the last few years, answers it. But to put it in a small example, my kids during the pandemic period lost their jobs because they were in industries that weren't adapting to the situation. But as we started out saying, the billionaires got richer, but it wasn't just the billionaires. I mean, I have mutual funds that plummeted in March and then suddenly went upwards and upwards and upwards and did ridiculously well this year. And what is it that caused, that kind of wealth to develop while other kinds of wealth were falling?
That is a terrific question. If I knew, I'd have more of a share of the mutual funds that you own shares in, if I knew the answer to that. But I will say, guess what? I am a historian, so I'm going to go historical here and say this is a reflection of how capitalism functions. And again, I'll think about the economist Joseph Schumpeter, who really defined capitalism in biological terms, right? He said capitalism, the most fundamental thing about it that we need to understand is that it's a perennial gale of creative destruction, right? It's a ceaseless ongoing storm of creation of new forms of value and business, and destruction of older ways of doing things. And in certain periods in history, the Great Depressions is a great example of this, economic collapses, the destruction can outpace or outweigh the creative aspects of capitalism, right? If you want to rent a movie to watch, you're not going to Blockbuster to rent it because Blockbuster no longer exists. It's been destroyed by newer ways of allowing you to purchase media and view media. You can stream it, you have Netflix, so forth. One tiny example, but this kind of creative destruction, we see the social costs that people who are thrown out of work bear when they experience the destructive side of American capitalism. And those of us who do have, fortunate enough to have retirement savings and have opened those envelopes as they come in each quarter or click to open your electronic statement, have seen the creative aspects of capitalism and the increases in returns to shareholders. Both things exist at the same time. Often, some have argued, the destructive aspects have fueled the creative aspects. The gains of the system are not shared equally. And the kind of broader and deeper increases in income inequality that we've seen in our recent history are reflective of that imbalance. Great question.
Well, Dr. Smith, thank you so very, very much for speaking with us today here and for joining us here at the Alaska World Affairs Council. And thank you everyone for tuning in and supporting our commitment to bringing quality education programs to you. It's our passion to increase global competency. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know, send them our way. We're trying to improve what we're doing, and we really enjoy what we're doing here virtually and being able to connect with you, Dr. Smith, through this platform. A warm thank you again for speaking to us today. We have recorded our program. We'll have it available for everyone on our website. You can access this program and our previous programs, and we hope to see you again. We're going to be busy in April. Put us on your calendar, and we'll see you again soon. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.